Tired of big tech clashing with your Catholic values? Fide Chat is now live on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. It's private, encrypted, and built by Catholics for Catholics, with features like parental controls and more. Connect securely with family, friends, and groups. Download Fide Chat at fide.email. Technology without compromise.
Are you still waiting on Pope Leo XIV to rescind Traditionis Custodes? Are you still waiting on him to issue a ruling that frees to some degree the traditional Mass? At least making it more free than what we have under Traditionis Custodes. If you are, why? We have seen since May scores of traditional Masses ended in the name of implementing Traditionis Custodes. We have news that was sent to me from a person I trust very much on this, because he was at the Mass when it happened. I got a screenshot of some letters, or from the letter from the bishop that was sent, and I posted about it on X, and then it took off. Not my posting of it, but it seems that within a few minutes of this friend of mine reaching out to me, who this affected, the other Catholics were posting about this on X, and it just took off yesterday. So we're going to talk about what happened here by first starting here with Rorate Caeli, since many of you will trust that more than just random friend of mine. The headline is, Traditional Latin Mass Annihilated in the Diocese of Knoxville, Tennessee. The cruelty taking place under Leo XIV is becoming loud and deafening. Rome does nothing. Tragic. And not even one alternative venue was offered in a diocese of 14,000 square miles, occupying all of East Tennessee. The current bishop was named by Francis last year. Now, before I show you the initial letter, and then give you the painful homily the priest gave, and the homily video is online. I couldn't finish watching it, but I can't just show it to you and give you commentary. So I'm going to go over the printed form, which he distributed to the laity. But it's a painful homily, because he asks everybody to just basically shut up and take it. Obey, as if obedience to what's going on is the highest virtue for a Catholic, and it's not. You don't have to be obedient to injustice. But it's worth pointing out here, more than anything else, for those waiting on Leo to do something. Before he was Pope Leo XIV, Cardinal Robert Prevost was the Cardinal Archbishop, who was the prefect for the Dicastery of Bishops. Bishop Beckman was appointed by Pope Francis. Part of the job of the prefect for the Dicastery of the Bishops is to recommend people to be bishops to the Pope. Now, Bishop Beckman, before he was an archbishop, would have been a bishop somewhere before that, and before that he would have been an auxiliary bishop, and before an auxiliary bishop he would have been a priest. But still, any step in the promotion, there would have been some checks and safeguards done by Rome to make sure the man has what the Pope is looking for. Meaning Cardinal Prevost was involved in that process at some point. So here is the initial letter. This is a photograph of what was given out to the parishioners. This is the short one, and then we'll go over the longer thing. Brothers and sisters in Christ, in collaboration with Bishop Mark Beckman and other pastors of parishes in our diocese, where the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite is currently celebrated, Masses in the extraordinary form will begin to transition to the ordinary form, meaning your TLM will soon become a Novus Ordo. This transition brings our diocese into conformity with what has been requested by Pope Francis in his motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes. What he's referring to there is in Traditionis Custodes and the letter that went with it, and as expressed also by the answer to the dubia that was given in December following Traditionis Custodes in 2021, it was repeated over and over again that the point of Traditionis Custodes was to bring rigid clericalist traditionalist Catholics back into the Novus Ordo. It explicitly talks about how we needed to be educated on how wonderful the new form of the Mass was. Meaning, for anybody who with eyes to see, Traditionis Custodes was meant to be temporary, with the end goal being essentially the traditional Mass relegated to a museum piece that might be offered here and there in the Vatican periodically, or by the FSSP wherever it was allowed, But there were also things in Traditionis Custodes that made it sound like the spread of the FSSP was going to be curbed. And so this is what he's talking about. This transition brings our diocese into conformity with what has been requested by Pope Francis in his motu proprio Traditionis Custodes. Let's continue. The final Mass in the extraordinary form will be offered at our parish on December 28th, 2025. Until that date, the extraordinary form will continue to be offered every Sunday with 3 exceptions. In order for us to celebrate the solemnity of Christ the King as one parish family, the ordinary form will be offered on October 26th, 30th Sunday in ordinary time, and November 23rd, Christ the King. In addition, December 14th, this third Sunday of Advent, will also be offered in the ordinary form. Now, why is he doing that? Because the Feast of Christ the King on the traditional Mass is on an entirely different date than that in the new Mass. In fact, anybody who's done any reading on what the Feast of Christ the King was before Vatican II and what Vatican II calls the Feast of Christ the King are entirely different things. They mean different things when they talk about the kingship of Christ. It's a whole other topic, but it has a lot. It ends up, when you understand what the kingship of Christ means in different ways, it radically changes the attitude of the church. Radically changes it. So they're offered on different days with different titles and different sort of focuses. Okay? Let's continue. Monday Mass at 6 p.m. will continue to be offered in the extraordinary form throughout the month of October. Beginning in November, this Mass will transition to the ordinary form, meaning the weekday evening daily Mass that they had, that was a traditional Mass, is going to be gone. As part of this transition, Mass will begin to be celebrated using the Missale Romanum, editio in Latin there. Despite this change, Mass will continue to include traditional elements that do not conflict with the Missal, meaning they're going to start changing the traditional Mass into a Novus Ordo by adding Novus Ordo elements to it, sort of kind of hobbling together from the looks of it, the transition Mass that was called. The 1962 liturgical book is what guides most traditional Latin Masses. Most, not all, but most of them. In the mid-60s, when it became clear that Rome was asking for more vernacular in the Mass, there was this thing called the traditional Mass, or the transitional Mass. It was kind of a weird hybrid, and that's what it looks like they're slowly moving through. He says, therefore, Mass will continue to be offered ad orientem. The altar arrangement will remain the same. We will continue to make use of the communion rail. Gregorian chant will retain its proper place in the liturgy. The Mass will continue to be offered in Latin, and there will be incense along with other traditional elements. I know that this transition will be difficult for some. As your pastor, please know that you are each in my prayers as we undergo this change together. It is my hope that we can embrace this transition with both faith and charity. We must remain united to Christ, for he is the vine and we are the branches. Without him, no matter how our motives or feelings, we will not bear much fruit, for apart from him we can do nothing. The Eucharist we receive is the same Lord who comes to us, no matter which form of the Church's liturgy is celebrated. Next Sunday, October 19th, I have scheduled time after the 2 p.m. Mass for anyone who would like to join me for a discussion regarding this transition. Let us turn toward the Lord and place our trust in him. In Christ, signed the pastor. Now, if you're going to go to that, I would hope that you are only a member of that parish. Please, if you're not a member of that parish, don't go. But if you are a member of that parish, please approach your priest with respect and with the dignity that his office has and the respect he is due. Comport yourself as a mature Catholic. Don't go off the rails when it comes to how you address this, because remember, the priest is, in this case, just a messenger bearing the bad news. It's not his fault. Even if I fundamentally disagree with some of the things you're about to hear in his homily. Rorate Caeli continues with this, saying, if that were not enough, the faithful in the Novus Ordo Mass in one of the venues, the basilicas of Saints Peter and Paul in Chattanooga, were subjected to this simultaneously pseudo-overeducated and misinformed homily, haranguing them about the traditional Mass. Just your usual cruel priest, this is a different parish, in a war against faithful Catholics and requesting obedience. Click for a better view. Well, I have an even better view because this was also sent to me by my trusted source. So we're all operating with the same information. This is official source material. When they say cruel, this is a cruel homily. Essentially hinting that anybody who disagrees with this is a schismatic, and saying that we will remain in full communion. He never mentions the SSPX by name, but they are the only people you ever hear in the church being referred to as in partial communion. For those who may not be aware, the SSPX are in full communion. There is no such thing as partial communion. Rome has said they are in communion. What they have said is there is no canonical status for them. They exist in canon law's equivalent of limbo. That's it. That their situation with Rome needs to be worked out between the bishops and leadership of the SSPX and the Vatican. There have been talks under Francis about the SSPX being given permission to consecrate more bishops. Reportedly, it was reduced to the essentially waiting on approval for the specific people. And then Pope Francis passed away. We don't know what Leo will do. If he is really continuing the program of Francis, which it looks like he's doing 100%, then maybe they'll be given permission by Leo to consecrate bishops. Now, I have the hot take that I don't think the SSPX needs to have their permission, but I understand why they're doing it. It's pretty obvious why they're doing it, because it's just good for the relationship with Rome. After all, they pray for the Pope in the Mass every Mass. They say his name in the canon of the Mass. They are in communion with the Roman Pontiff. They just treat the Roman hierarchy as if they've all gotten intoxicated on the heresy of modernism, which is true. They have. You cannot align what a lot of they say these days, for the last 60 years or so, with what came before. So their attitude is basically, if your father ordered you to do something, you would do it. But if your father ordered you to do something while he'd had like 17 beers in an hour, and then he told you to go do something that was clearly a bad idea, you wouldn't go do it. That's kind of their attitude about it. So here we go now to this painful homily given by the priest in Chattanooga, delivering the news. For those who may not be aware, when you hear this, I saw a question online being asked, how do you get the SSPX to open up a parish or a chapel in your diocese? And the answer I saw from people in the know was, you need 50 families who will commit to going to Mass there. And you need the money to cover the expenses for the priest to do the Mass, meaning travel, because sometimes they have to fly them in. Maybe something like lunch, because again, we're talking something that's a serious time commitment, a few other things. They can't operate for free after all. The things cost money. And also it sounds like you would need a place to offer the Mass, whether it's in a spare room in a house somewhere, or a barn, or a closed up business on a Sunday, or, if you've got somehow, by some miracle, a closed up chapel, closed up church somewhere that you can use. If you want me to reach out to somebody I know who is kind of a controversial figure in Catholic circles and traditional circles, but is an expert on this, I could probably get somebody on to have this discussion with people, because this is not going to be the last time we see this happen. So let me know if you want to see that. But let's go to that painful, tone-deaf homily given by a priest that I am certain thinks he was doing the right thing. Treasures new and old, unity in faith post Traditionis Custodes. Pastoral letter published October 12th, 2025 by the Very Reverend J. David Carter, pastor and rector of the Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul. As you are aware, in 2021, Pope Francis issued the now familiar motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, which limited the celebration of the 1962 Roman Missal that many refer to as the traditional Latin Mass, overturning the previous legislation of liberality of Summorum Pontificum, issued by Pope Benedict XVI in 2007. This came as a heavy weight to bear for our community. Since Christmas 2014, we have had the benefit of the celebration of the Mass according to the 1962 Missal at least monthly. In 2020, after discerning the legitimate desires of the faithful and responding to the still enforced directives of Pope Benedict XVI, we were able to begin offering Mass using the 1962 Roman Missal every Sunday at the 11:30 Mass time. Thus, 1 year later, when Traditionis Custodes came out, it disrupted our pastoral plan. I preached then that as a parishioners of Saints Peter and Paul, we understand ourselves to be a Novus Ordo parish at which there is a traditional Latin Mass. Now, as an aside, this is the status of most diocesan traditional Latin Masses. Going to a diocesan one, meaning not an FSSP, not Institute of Christ the King or a group like that, then it's going to be a parish that is dedicated to the new form of the Mass, and just tolerates or has a traditional Mass. And I say tolerates because my first experience with a traditional Latin Mass that wasn't a wedding, because my first one was a wedding, was at a diocesan parish that was very progressive, but weirdly had a traditional Latin Mass. And I've told the story before, I won't tell it here, but it was a weird situation. But that's how it is in most places. The priest continues saying, and that the primary purpose of our celebrating the 1962 Roman Missal, that's the TLM Missal, was for the purpose of mutual enrichment between the two forms, which is one of Pope Benedict XVI's stated goals when he issued Summorum Pontificum. Already at that time, I very strongly suggested that we receive the new legislation with humility and obedience, and we fight the temptation to go against proper ecclesial authority even when we disagree. In other words, even in 2021, he told people to suck it up and accept Traditionis Custodes. We must make the choice to be either Catholic or Protestant. Those of us who resist this are Protestants. The irony is that so many people would choose the trappings of Catholic identity over the essence, which is union with the successor of Peter. As for Saints Peter and Paul, we are going to be Catholic. That's putting everyone watching this on notice. This is while the parishioners of that parish are down, kicking them while they are down. After the motu proprio came out, working with our previous bishop, we were asked to continue the status quo until these matters could be worked out. Bishop Mark Beckman took up the reins of governance of the Diocese of Knoxville in 2024. Wisely and prudently, he did not want to make major changes in his first year. Now, that means Bishop Mark Beckman is already better than the Bishop of Charlotte, by the way, who issued these things immediately. Before he could look, listen, and learn. As you know, I work closely with Bishop Beckman in my diocesan roles. Many times he has remarked to me how impressed he is by the Basilica Parish, and he acknowledged the great fruitfulness we have, particularly in our liturgy. Jesus praised the obedience and docile spirit of the centurion, who said the memorialized words that we use every time we celebrate Mass, Domine non sum dignus. As he said those words, he recognized that he was a man under authority and knew how authority worked. Bishop Beckman, after a year of listening, called together the pastors of the parish where the usus antiquor, meaning the traditional Mass, is celebrated to discern our duty of obedience in this moment with what the Church is asking of us. Here's the kicker. Why are you waiting for Pope Leo to intervene? Here's the kicker for that. The bishop received a letter from the dicastery for the liturgy asking him to respond with his implementation of Traditionis Custodes in the Diocese of Knoxville. Bishop Beckman reiterated that he loves the people that go to the Latin Mass. He did not wish ill on anyone who loves ancient things, but he very publicly professed an oath of fidelity to the Roman pontiff and the laws of the Church, the same as every priest and deacon under holy orders. Like the centurion, Bishop Beckman is bound to holy obedience, and so am I. We are not masters of the liturgy. We are its servants. The reality is we've been living on borrowed time since 2021. We knew the status quo we have enjoyed would not last forever. Another pastoral reality already confronting us is the lack of clergy qualified to offer the usus antiquor in the future. And here's another pause here. Tell you why that is. Because Traditionis Custodes banned allowing new priests except under extraordinary circumstances from being given permission to offer the traditional Mass. Another measure taken to ensure the traditional Mass would go extinct. That was the point of Traditionis Custodes. And people dance around it, but it's the truth. The point was to make it go away. Now you're seeing it play out in real time. The priest continues saying, I am the only priest available to celebrate the 1962 Missal here at the Basilica. And we have asked ourselves the question, what happens if I get hit by a bus or I'm out of town on a Sunday? Another thing to note is how the two liturgical calendars periodically divide our parish. This is where he says the TLM is divisive. He means it in the literal sense. We currently have a split calendar between the Novus Ordo and the ancient form, which causes division, where half of our parish celebrates one feast and one set of readings, and the other celebrates another feast and another set of readings. I have raised these issues with my parish pastoral council in the past, and especially in light of the recent letter from Rome to Bishop Beckman. There is a common consensus, meaning here's where he gets into the synodal decision-making process, that the people of our parish desire the traditions, the transcendence and reverence in the way we do liturgy here more than they are attached to any one form. Meaning you're going to have your TLM replaced with a unicorn Mass, a reverent Novus Ordo. Except I have encountered many people who said the reverent Novus Ordo was what broke them and made them go to the traditional Mass fully. I know a lot of you will not understand how that can be. He says, having discussed this matter with a parish pastoral council and then bringing that discernment to our bishop, I would like to now focus on the unity of faith in our parish. Here's the decision. The Diocese of Knoxville will be transitioning all celebrations of the Latin Mass from using the 1962 Missal to the 2002 Missal in Latin by the end of the year. In this way, we will not be losing the Latin Mass or the Roman Rite at the Basilica. Sensitive to how difficult this is for many, Bishop Beckman has given assurances that the legitimate aspirations for transcendent, classical, traditional, and beautiful liturgies can be accommodated, and that our celebration of the 2002 Roman Missal, that is a Novus Ordo Missal, can and should be done in a way that causes the least rupture and highlights the most continuity with the tradition of the Church. I know this is not what many in our community would prefer. I know this will be difficult to receive for many who have grown to love the more ancient form of worship. However, I would like to make a clear call to the parish that we respond in humility and obedience, and that we cultivate a mature response to these changes. In other words, submit. Go back to Traditionis Custodes. What it called us for was to be re-educated on how great the new Mass is. It's in the document and in the letter to the bishops that went with it. If we do not respond humility, meaning we just don't go along with it, then we aren't actually Catholic. He said earlier that you are Protestant if you reject this. If you reject being forced to attend essentially Protestantized liturgy. I hate to be the one to tell you this, but the guys who wrote the new Mass explicitly wanted it to be Protestantized. They said as much. They wanted it to remove all stumbling blocks for Protestants to become Catholic. And instead, I've encountered many Protestants who are thinking about becoming Catholic, who saw the new Mass and were like, this is like exactly what I have at my Presbyterian or Lutheran or whatever church. Why would I convert? Oops. Anyway, the reality is that no one will be deprived of the sacraments. In fact, the faithful who believe erroneously that they are not receiving the Eucharist legitimately or fruitfully in the Novus Ordo are the ones Pope Francis rightly called out. We cannot remain Catholic simply by holding on to expressions of Catholicism, but rather by living into its essence, which is union with the legitimate successor of St. Peter and abiding by his governance of the Church. This is him telling you not to resist. It is clear that the Church's mind is moving away from the celebration of the Mass according to the 1962 Missal and towards the unity of faith by celebrating according to the 2002 third typical edition of the Roman Missal. That is where he tells you, stop waiting for Pope Leo to intervene. He's not going to. And I will give you something Leo said. He made a little jab about this in a homily over the weekend. He says, I truly believe that this transition to the 2002 Missal, accompanied by all its traditional options, will respond to the legitimate aspirations for a transcendent, reverent liturgy we have here at the Basilica. It is my hope that obedience to this request from the Church can ensure the beautiful, reverent liturgy does not disappear out of a misplaced idealism that would make the perfect become the enemy of the good by idolizing one form of the liturgy over another. Now you are an idolater if you will not go to the new Mass. And he is saying that we could lose reverent new Masses if you resist, because you're an idolater. Yeah. This is kicking people while they're down. But look at this. Make the perfect become the enemy of the good. He's admitting that the new Mass is lesser than the traditional Mass. You don't say this when trying to sell people on the new Mass without admitting that all of our concerns about the true Mass or about the traditional Mass have valid concerns, that there are valid concerns about it. You don't call the traditional Mass the perfect and the new Mass the good, lesser than the perfect, without admitting that the new Mass is lesser than the traditional Mass. Did this bishop have a PR person read this? Then he goes on, we are not idolaters to a particular rite as a parish. Again, calling you and I idolaters. We do not reject the validity of the Second Vatican Council or the New Order of the Mass. You know, not all traditionalists reject the validity of the Second Vatican Council or the New Order of Mass. I, being a very harsh critic of the New Order of things in general in the Church, will tell you the new Mass is valid, but our concerns are more than just its validity. We also acknowledge that the 2002 Missal can be celebrated in ways that will respond to the legitimate aspirations of the majority of people asking for what they have found in the 1962 Missal. Except, and I hate to keep interjecting like this, the dicastery for the liturgy has already said repeatedly that you're not to put in what they called accretions of the traditional liturgy into the new Mass. They've said that. They're going to tolerate it here for the transition period. because it's re-educating us on how great the new Mass is. But at some point, they're going to say, stop with the Reverent Novus Ordo Masses. They are, after all, community-centered, people-centered events. Go read Sacrosanctum Concilium. It's a radical document on the liturgy. Here's what he continues to say. He says, I believe that as a parish, we have borne the fruit desired by Pope Benedict XVI from Summorum Pontificum. And now it's time for us to apply it to the current Roman Missal. We have achieved the mutual enrichment that Pope Benedict XVI encouraged. Seriously, are you serious? We have learned from our past, and now we are being sent to the future with what we have learned and been formed in. This is the language of a progressive, by the way, who tolerated conservative things. It is my hope and prayer that by celebrating the 2002 third typical edition of the Roman Rite in Latin, that's the new Mass in Latin, according to the most recent liturgical edit of it, with all the traditional elements allowed for already in the rubrics, we will indeed fulfill the legitimate aspirations of the faithful for transcendent liturgy, reverent expressions of worship, and access to the venerable traditions that sustain us and feed us. I am inspired in this discernment by the passage in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus gives us the wisdom that, quote, every scribe who has been instructed in the kingdom of heaven is like the head of a household who brings from his storeroom both the new and the old. Using the traditional elements in continuity is tapping into biblical advice to bring forth from the storehouse that which is old. At the same time, using the 2002 third typical edition of the Roman Rite opens us up to that which the Church has given to us in the reform of the liturgy, in particular the amplified cycle of readings and the encouragement of deeper active participation in the Holy Sacrifice. This allows us to access that which is new from the storeroom. I could spend a lot of time calling that out, what he's saying here, as nonsense. I could, but I'll save that for another time. In fact, we can even see some positive benefits of transitioning to the 2002 Roman Missal with traditional elements. The two calendars which divided our community will be unified and become a source of unity across all our masses. Christ the King, Holy Family, Baptism of the Lord, etc. These are the feasts that are different on the calendar because they have different meanings in the new order of the Mass and in the new ecclesiology of the Church than they did before. We will now experience the benefit of unity in our celebrations as a community. Also, many more scriptures will be heard through a 3-year cycle of readings. No, they won't. Come on. Including the much more Old Testament readings, which are rarely heard in the ancient lectionary while still maintaining the beauty of the ancient gradual and Alleluia. We can rejoice that we are united in faith with the universal church, that all the good fruit of the reform of the liturgy will be preserved, along with all the beautiful traditions that the Novus Ordo allows. In other words, look at that. We can rejoice that we are united in faith. Implication being, if you stuck to the traditional Mass, you were not united in faith, because the faith that the traditional Mass represents is different than the faith that the new Mass offers. That is what he is saying. This is not a radical trad take on this. He is saying this. A lot of us who are critical of the new Mass don't say this stuff. So much of what we enjoy in the traditional Latin Mass will be present. I anticipate it will be difficult for many to even notice the difference. Oh, yes, they will. If they've been paying attention, they will notice. Our Unity of Faith movement will begin at the Feast of Christ the King in the new calendar, November 23rd, 2025. This feast was a recent addition to the calendar in 1925, when it was placed on the last Sunday of October. The Church has since determined that it is more fitting at the end of the liturgical year to celebrate when Christ will come in his glory to reign. The Church's discernment in moving the feast is not evil nor bad. We, in fact, can see great good in this. Its original placement on last Sunday of October was somewhat arbitrary. Okay, so this is flabbergasting. I missed this in my first read-through. The person who placed the Feast of Christ the King in 1925 on the calendar where he did was Pope Pius XI. This, he says, after remaining in unity with the Roman Pontiff. That is hinting that being critical of this move by Rome, by the Pope, is a schismatic act. And then he called the placement of the Feast of Christ the King arbitrary. What Pius XI said about the kingship of Christ is fundamentally different than what the post-Vatican II Church has said about the Feast of Christ the King and what the kingship of Christ means. It's in the name, Christ King of the universe, versus this, talking about the social reign of Christ the King. They're fundamentally different things. One is a more abstract, distant kind of idea, and the other is an idea that has fundamental consequences for how Catholics should interact with everything in the world, including how we govern things. Fundamentally different. This is amazing. The last Sunday of the liturgical year has more purpose. We can see wisdom in the new way. This is him trying to sell you on the revolution in the church. On October 26th, the last Sunday of October, we will still celebrate Christ the King according to the 1962 calendar at the 11:30 Mass as normal, even as we celebrate the 30th Sunday in ordinary time at our other Masses. However, in the interest of having a unified parish celebrating the Christ the King in November, we will also celebrate the solemnity of Christ the King as a parish community at all of our Masses on the last Sunday of the liturgical year, November 23rd, when the Church in her wisdom has now designated that this feast is to be celebrated. Meaning that's going to be, again, as he said earlier, when the traditional Mass will be gone and the transition Mass will begin, at least for that Sunday. The 11:30 Mass that day will follow the 2002 Roman Missal and continue to be celebrated in that way from then on. Christ the King will lead us in the beginning of the new liturgical year, unified in faith. The 11:30 Latin Mass will continue its pride of place as the most solemn traditional Latin Mass that we can celebrate, according to the 2002 edition of the Roman Missal. I need to speak bluntly to you as a father to his children. Don't be Protestant. Trads, you're being Protestant. This is like the kind of stuff you see from trolls on Twitter who don't have a good argument against you, so they just call you a Protestant. If you feel so strongly about the 1962 edition of the Missal that you would separate yourself from union with the Church rather than follow the current Missal of the Universal Church, I urge you to repent. This is nothing more than the spirit of Protestantism. I exhort you to open the ears of your heart and mind to the successor of the apostles, the bishops in union with the Pope. Be wary of harboring a rebellious spirit in your heart. Guard your heart in this moment. The danger of schism is very real. Do not be lured by the promises and sophistries of those who have the appearance of devotion, but at heart they have rejected union with the Church. Let me be clear. The Society of St. Pius X, SSPX, even if they appear to hold on to ancient ways and practices, are in a rebellious and irregular state, and the faithful are discouraged from attending Masses offered by priests of the Society. That is his opinion. Rome has said you can attend their Masses. Rome has spoken on the issue. You may attend the Masses of the SSPX, and you can give to their parishes. They have said this. And here's the thing. Even if Rome had not said that, you could still do it anyway. Because all the SSPX did was plant their feet firmly and decide they wanted to preserve the faith as it had been taught for like 1900 years before some people thought they were doing Jesus a favor by changing everything in the Church. It is my duty to remind the faithful that a formal adherence to a schismatic movement, that's the traditionalist movement, constitutes the canonical delict of schism, for which there is an automatic excommunication attached. He's threatening you with excommunication if you don't go along with this. I would note that the Pontifical Council for Legislative Text defined adherence as, quote, opting in such a way for the followers of Lefebvre that this option is placed above obedience to the Pope. By the way, note the date on that, 1997. That's before Pope Benedict XVI lifted all the excommunications and everything. Kind of dated. I have often exhorted the faithful in my preaching that we are called to be right, but in the right way. We may share some of the sentiments held by those who have struggled with the Church's movement in these past decades. But we must not abandon the ship or put our allegiance in our own will and preference. I exhort you not to harbor schismatic thoughts in your soul or to act on them in a misplaced passion for preferences on holy things. I exhort you not to be Protestant. What a wicked document this is. We're not alone in bemoaning the loss of something beautiful, but we are not losing the Mass. Rather, we are gaining unity with fellow Catholics throughout the world that celebrate the Reformed liturgy, because what he's saying here is you weren't unified with them. What does that say, by the way, about our Eastern brethren? Eastern Catholics, they are 100% Catholic. There should be no doubt that Eastern Rite Catholics are 100% Catholic. They may go to the Mass of St. John Chrysostom, the Divine Liturgy, rather, of St. John Chrysostom, or the Divine Liturgy of St. Charbel, or some other Divine Liturgy that the Church has authorized. That is not the Latin Rite, because the new Mass and the traditional Latin Mass and the other various forms of the Latin Rite are just peculiar to the West, in the same way that the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is peculiar to certain Eastern rites. Is he saying that they are not unified with fellow Catholics? What unifies us isn't only the liturgy, it's also the profession of faith. And this is where a lot of traditional Catholics get hung up with the order of things. Because what they preach in Rome all too often has the whiff of sulfur about it, of a new gospel, of making a better world, reducing Jesus's miracles to the miracle of sharing instead of actually a miracle, reducing them to worldly symbols instead of actual faith. Traditional Catholics have a lot more in common with Eastern Rite Catholics than those who cheerlead for the revolution in the church. And when I say traditional, I mean traditionally minded. I don't split hairs here. I don't usually go after Catholics dedicated to the new Mass, who they go to the new Mass for their own reasons. But they have the faith still. I don't go after them. There's no reason to. But here he is saying that traditional Catholics are not united with the rest of the church. And by implication, neither are Eastern Rite Catholics. Like I said, what a wicked document. We also have the opportunity to help shape the liturgy from our years of celebrating the Latin Mass, until, Rome tells you no. Rather than looking at it from the perspective of losing something, we can see it as gaining an opportunity to revisit Sacrosanctum Concilium with its legitimate call to reform the Roman Rite, while at the same time answering the legitimate aspirations of the faithful expressed over many generations for maintaining continuity with our tradition, in the various options and practices provided for in the rubrics of the new form of the Mass. This is the moment when we are called to holy obedience to Holy Mother Church. I urge us all to correspond with maturity and spirit, rejoicing in both the old and the new. Sincerely in Christ, Father David Carter, pastor and rector, yada, yada, yada. That is something much more like as a document that is more violent than something I typically saw under Francis. War's right up there. William Dixon gifted 10 Return to Tradition memberships. That is appreciated, sir. Thank you. You will find, I don't have control who gets those. YouTube will give those out to people who are probably fairly regular in the live. I'm very curious what you thought of that letter. And I'm going to show you, for those holding out on Pope Leo, when this happened. He gave a homily at something that was utterly unrelated, but there's a line in here that just seems too good to be true. This was given the homily by His Holiness Pope Leo XIV at St. Peter's Square on the 28th Sunday in Ordinary Time. It's a jubilee of Marian spirituality. A lot of this is fine. No critique here on a lot of things. Talk about the Virgin Mary and things, which is always nice. But note this. This is peculiar. And I'm not the only one who noticed this. In fact, this was brought to my attention by a Bergoglian on X who posted this smugly because he knew what the time was. This is the Holy Father in his own words. The lepers in the gospel who did not return to give thanks, this is after the healing of the lepers, remind us that God's grace can touch us and find no response. It can heal us, yet we can still fail to accept it. Let us take care, therefore, not to go up to the temple in such a way that does not lead us to follow Jesus. Some forms of worship do not foster communion with others and can numb our hearts. In these cases, we fail to encounter the people of God that God has placed in our lives. We fail to contribute, as Mary did, to changing the world and to share in the joy of the Magnificat. Let us take care to avoid any exploitation of the faith that could lead to labeling those who are different, often the poor, as enemies, lepers to be avoided and rejected. Amazing. And read in a certain way, this almost looks like he could be calling out the bishop. He just called us Protestants, after all. So maybe the bishop should take care to avoid any exploitation of the faith that could lead to labeling those who are different, often the poor, as enemies, to be avoided and rejected. But he's saying some forms of worship do not foster communion with others and can numb our hearts. And notice here, he kind of invoked the neo-gospel of the post-conciliar synodal church when he says, we fail to contribute, as Mary did, to changing the world. There's only one way you can legitimately change the world as a Catholic, and you know what it is? Spreading the gospel, bringing souls to Jesus Christ, helping people to live Catholic lives. And from there, it will follow naturally that the world will change if most people are Catholic. It will change. That's the only way. Everything else is superficial. Everything else is a political flash in the pan of the moment. But if you're waiting on Leo for this, why? I'd love to be wrong. But here, I'll show you the Bergoglian who is weirdly well connected in Rome. I got a lot of questions about his connections. He's a high school teacher, but he knows things before anybody else seems to. He said, amid pressures and tactics on the part of some for the Pope to overturn Traditionis Custodes, or at least loosen the motu proprio's restrictions, a notable line from Leo's homily is telling, quote, some forms of worship do not foster communion with others and can numb our hearts. Has the traditional Mass numbed your heart? As someone who had gone to the ordinary form for years and then made the transition to the traditional Mass and embraced the traditions of the church, it didn't numb my heart. I'm sure that you have the same story to tell. Rather, I almost wonder if these people who are dedicated to the revolution in the church, who, with a smile on their face, call you a Protestant while they crush your traditional Mass, if their heart hasn't been hardened and numbed by the spirit of revolution. This is an amazing day in the church. There's another story that broke over the weekend worth a little bit of time for you today. And we're going to talk about that before we finish this up. Completely unrelated. Out of Peru, a story broke over the weekend that was utterly amazing. A priest was outed in the international secular media for violating his vows. And some of you are going to rejoice when you see this news for partially the right reason, but partially the wrong reason too. Not exactly the most trustworthy source most of the time, but this story does check out. The Daily Mail out of the UK. The headline, Peruvian bishop is accused of having 17 secret lovers after being exposed by the cleaning lady, as mistresses started fighting over him. Peruvian bishop. When this story broke, I saw numerous people pointing out that it was from Peru, where Pope Leo is from. I'm not saying he was involved in this, certainly not. But there have been whispers about him knowing things. I mean, you remember the controversy that surrounded him the day he was named Pope. People going, well, hold on, there were all these stories out of Peru about his handling of bishops' cases and things. But some of you will be rejoicing on the story. For one reason, I consider kind of both the right reason and the wrong reason. And you'll notice this in the headline, the word mistresses, meaning his secret affairs he was having were with women. It is a sad day in the church when we can laugh and be thankful that it was with women as opposed to the other option. Well, the other options, including people too young to consent to such activities. I can already see later in today the comments will be, oh, at least it was women. There's a lot of questions here about this story, especially since there's a lot that I hear from coming from South America that I can't report, but there's a lot of weird stories out of Peru, a lot of weird ones. So just pray that the truth about those weird stories comes to light, whether the truth is that those stories are false, or that if they are true, that people who have the ability to bring evidence can do so. The truth must prevail. The truth of this story, well, I'll go to an unlikely source for it. Here are the details. A Peruvian bishop accused of having 17 secret mistresses has handed in his resignation after reportedly being exposed by his cleaning lady. Chiriquispe Lopez, 51, the bishop of Juli in Peru, resigned his prestigious post following an investigation by the Vatican that revealed some of the women nearly physically fought each other after finding out the truth. Paulo Yugas, a Peruvian journalist, said, quote, a nun who was one of Quispe's lovers was jealous of a lawyer the bishop was also seeing and sent information about his affairs to a third lover who got into a fight with a lawyer, end quote. A nun who was one of his lovers. Welcome to the post-conciliar church. If you think that's an unfair dig at Vatican II, in the immediate aftermath of Vatican II, one of the things that ended up happening was that psychologists were unleashed on religious communities, especially women's religious communities, by bishops around the world. It was almost like it was coordinated from somewhere. And what ended up happening is wherever those psychologists went, vocations collapsed, women left religious orders, a lot of religious orders just went away. It happened in the years afterwards. Very, very well documented. There are people that I chat with periodically who are actually experts on the state of women religious, who say that my rather harsh coverage of what the Rome does to women religious doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of how bad it actually is. And you got a hint there at that. Now, Malachi Martin in Windswept House made it sound like there were like covens in some monasteries or convents. And I know that sounds radical, but I've had that corroborated from other people. All because in the aftermath of Vatican II, they brought in psychologists to help make sure these women wouldn't be too rigid. Because as most of you know, that when you meet like a woman who is dedicated to traditional values and traditional living, they honestly are, like, it's not just like a facade, but they actually are. They are some of the most rigid people you will ever meet. Those are the kind of women who belong in the religious life if they have got the calling. But a nun, as well as a lawyer, and the nun sent it out to a third person that was involved in this. This sounds like a really terrible Hollywood movie. Back to the article, quote, she added in an interview with the Times, it was a real soap opera, but also lifted the lid on a serious abuse of power. Many of the 17 women were too scared to come forward because they were frightened of him. Lopez is said to have been caught out after he accidentally sent photos and videos intended for his mistresses to his cleaner, who quickly filed a complaint to the Catholic Church. The Vatican reportedly combed through sordid voice notes, photos, and videos Lopez sent to his mistresses. But the disgraced clergyman denies the allegations, describing them as a defamation campaign conducted by, quote, dark hands. I pray that he is correct. I pray that he is correct. Pray yourselves for the truth of this to come out. Because if he is correct, then his name should be cleared. Lopez is also said to have been under investigation by the Vatican for allegedly embezzling church funds. He is said to have been accused of removing chairs from church property to be used in a chicken restaurant chain they had a financial interest in. It's oddly specific. The chain is called Pastas Arriba, which means upside down, but literally translates to legs in the air. The Vatican accepted Lopez's resignation early last month, more than 20 years ahead of when bishops ordinarily retire at the age of 75. Right out of Peru. Pray that the truth emerge in that story, as well as other things that there are whispers about in Peru. And finally, I know many of you are not fans of the current president, of President Trump. Many of you are very big fans of his. He said something over the weekend on X that no matter what you think of him, should get you to pause what you're doing and pray for him, no matter what you think of him. He took to social media. He said this on, I think, Truth Social. He said, I don't think there's anything that's going to get me in heaven. I really don't. I think I'm not maybe heaven bound. I may be in heaven right now as we fly in Air Force One. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make heaven, but I've made life better for a lot of people. And none of that would matter if he's right. Because we know it's not our works alone that get us into heaven. Works are part of what we're called to do by Christ, but they're not what get us into heaven. They're an expression of the faith. Pray for him. If you hate him, pray for him. Jesus commanded us to pray for our enemies. And if you think he's the greatest thing ever, pray for him. The road to salvation begins with the recognition that there's something higher than you. He has publicly said or talked about God before, many times, as if he believes. He's made it sound like he believes. But many of you will not believe him. But a statement like what I just read to you from him isn't the kind of thing you just put out there. It sounds like he believes, but that he's also recognized that he is a grave sinner with a lot of unconfessed sins that are holding him down, and vices and attitudes that he cannot let go of. It's a terrible place to be, especially for a man of his age. However, the recognition of that and of what the consequences could be means that he seems to have recognized something that is crucial to the path of conversion. which is that there's a barrier between him and heaven. And that barrier is himself. Pray for him. There is no greater force on this planet than Christians being unified in the prayer for conversion of somebody. If you love him, pray for him. If you hate him, pray for him. If you're indifferent for him, pray for him. That is a call for help. That's a cry for help you saw. As an adult convert, I know what that's like, where he is, because that was where I was before I became a Catholic. He is surrounded by Christians of all stripes praying for him. It seems to be having some kind of effect on him. So please pray for him and for his safety. I don't need to reiterate to you how insane the news has gotten on the threats to public figures who are not part of the Marxist wokerati. You don't need me to reiterate it. You've been paying attention. You know how weird things are getting out there and how dangerous they are. But pray for him, especially if you don't like him. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. A little longer of a live stream than normal, such as the way things are when major news breaks. Elaine asks, can this Pope be referred to in a certain secret of Fatima who will be ascending a hill amidst devastation? I don't know. I'm becoming more and more skeptical of the Fatima timeline that everybody's touting because people are touting it with such certainty. Just be prepared to live in a state of, try to be in a state of grace as much as you can. But he could be, but for that to happen, it would require him to come to the realization that he needs to do the consecration and order the bishops of the world to do it in union with him on pain of excommunication. That's what it would take. And who knows, maybe a major war breaks out soon where suddenly his hand is forced, where he comes to this realization that he and all of his predecessors back to Pius XII were responsible for where we are because they disobeyed the mandate of heaven. All right, folks. Again, Tom Bunnyale says we should do some live streams of praying together for specific things. I don't lead prayers publicly. I'm not a priest. That is not a dig at those who do, but I would feel like a fraud doing it. So that's why I don't do it. That's not, again, not a dig at any Catholic commentator who leads public prayers. I am glad they feel comfortable doing that. I do not feel comfortable doing that. But I do recommend that people pray for him in the same way that you would want your enemies, those who are critical of you, to pray for you. But like I said, yeah, let me know what you think of all this in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. And share this on social media. It helps too. And pray for that bishop we started this with, and pray for Pope Leo. This is a dangerous path the church is going down right now. That much the bishop in that letter is right about. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.